Serious? Police of Reddit. Who was the worst criminal you've ever had to detain? What did they do? How did you feel once they'd been arrested? Worst ever for me was a guy who tortured his girlfriend's 3 small children until one died. The scene was subtle yet horrific when we started putting the pieces together. The children initially wouldn't speak about the suspect at all, and now a couple years later they only make cryptic statement like, "If I did X, he would come and do Y." It was the only time in my career I've seen a cause of death ruled as torture. The earliest memorable person is a 16-year-old who killed 2 men by stabbing them in the head with a screwdriver. He was just acting the hard man in front of his mates and picked on these 2 guys for nothing. The thing that got me was his complete lack of remorse or regret. I'd never properly understood what a psychopath was until then. Had a call once in a major metropolitan area during my probation period some years ago. The fire dept called us for help, saying they had been threatened with by knife-wielding maniac while attempting to render aid to someone. My partner and I got there and saw the FD just standing around, so we're thinking, okay, this guy is probably gone and we will have to just take a report for them and get to our next call. That's the first time I heard the screams of someone about to die. The shrill terror in a person's voice is completely distinguishable from your everyday scream for help or yells of anger. It sends a shiver down your spine. My partner and I didn't have time for backup to arrive or make a tactical plan, so we entered an apartment complex by ourselves and followed the screams until we located a door we thought they were coming from. I kicked in the door and we entered to find that knife-wielding madman stabbing a woman in the chest. Shots are fired and the man goes down. As though a scene from a movie, after the shooting, backup comes running in to clear the rest of the apartment while I awkwardly handcuff this man who is bleeding all over my uniform. He's missing one of the 2 wrist bones from a bullet shattering it. There's blood everywhere, and you can smell it in the air. This is also the first time I held a person while they were dying, which isn't particularly pleasant either. The man passed shortly after in the ambulance, even with the fire dept outside already. We later discovered the man was on drugs and suffering from mental illness. He had attempted to kill himself a week prior and failed, so the higher-ups believe this is how he wanted to finish himself off. The woman survived. I'm terrible with dates and time frames if I didn't write it down, but I'll never forget the 26th of October, 2013. This was in Brooklyn. Squad called an 85 at such and such address. A neighbor had called in an assault in progress and the detective squad happened to be on the block for another reason. They got there fast and met the perp coming out the front door. We get there a couple minutes after as the perp is being walked in handcuffs to the car. I went into the house to see if everybody was okay and what the 85 was about. Long story short, perp hacked a woman and her 4 kids, infant to 12 years old, to death with a meat cleaver. Mom and oldest was still breathing when we came in the door, but not for long after that. 3 babies were all in the back bedroom. The apartment looked pretty much like what you would imagine if you tried to imagine something like that. You could taste the blood in the air. There was so much of it. When I walked out to get a look at the perp, a detective told me, "See if you can get his name but don't ask him anything else." Guy was seated in the backseat in handcuffs and had a look in his eyes that I can't even describe here. The devil was let loose in that apartment. I was a detective in the town I worked at, and of course had to cover calls on a rotation. I was on call on Halloween one night and got a call about a shooting that had just occurred in a fairly decent part of the town I worked in. I was already out due to another incident and decided to head on that way, figuring if there was anything to it, I would get called anyways. Being that it was Halloween in the part of town, I of course thought this was just another prank call. As I'm heading to the call, dispatch advised that they are getting multiple calls and reports of multiple victims. With this, I realized this probably wasn't a prank call and actually ended up being the first person on scene. Turns out that some kids were trick-or-treating, and when they knocked on the door of this one house, the guy inside freaked out and unloaded an AK-47 through the glass door into 2 kids and the father, the kids being over 10 but less than 14. The oldest child took most of the bullets, killing him. The father and the younger child survived. I then spent 3 hours interviewing the suspect. I've interviewed a lot of suspects, murderers included, and this was the most mentally and physically exhausting interview of my life. That was almost 8 years ago and the whole thing still haunts me. My partner and I chased down a kidnapper rapist. Guy convinced a petite drunk girl to go into an alley. While back there he beat her and tried to repay her. She was wearing jeans and he couldn't get them off. If she hadn't been wearing jeans, he'd have completed the act. A passerby called 911 and my partner and I stopped him less than a block away. His fly was down and he hadn't even put his dong back in his pants. We caught a lucky break too. The entire attack was caught on a security camera we were able to immediately obtain. Watching the video nearly made me cry on duty. With that arrest we were able to close out 3 other sexual assaults. The guy was a serial rapist who usually preyed on homeless women. He was homeless himself. It's been 1.5 years since the arrest. We go to trial in a few weeks. I can't wait to put him behind bars for a very long time. Received a call from a concerned neighbor in an apartment complex. She advised a female upstairs was screaming for help. Me and my partner conducted a knock and talk and a very large male answered the door wearing boxers. We asked him if anyone else was in the apartment. He looked back towards the bedroom, turned and looked back at us and paused for a second and then said no. Me and my partner looked at each other sensing something was wrong. We looked down and observed blood on the tile floor and made entry due to exigent circumstances. I spoke with the male in the living room and I see he was getting extremely worried. My partner walked into the bedroom and I see his face lose its color. He stepped back and started shouting, "Lock his butt up now." He then tried to make a run for it. After he was detained we returned to the room and I saw a girl locked in a dog cage beaten half to death. The investigation revealed he had been holding her hostage in the apartment for several months, upping her and pimping her out to sick freaks and forcing her to eat dog food. She was unable to stand. I believe both legs and arms were broken. Both eye sockets were so badly broken and bruised they swelled up over her eyes. The bedsheet, which I could only assume was once white, was completely covered in bloodstains. I've been on the scene of somewhere around 100 plus murders, countless auto fatalities and everything in between, and to this day it's just about the only thing that gets to me. I couldn't understand how someone could be that evil. When I returned to my patrol vehicle to run their information, I looked at her driver's license photo and couldn't recognize her. That's how badly she had been beaten. I've seen her once since the incident. She is now blind in both eyes and can still hardly walk. It sucks to think about how many times I've been at that apartment building on other calls while she was locked in a cage and had probably been standing just feet away from her. The entire time the suspect was in my backseat, he was just staring me down through my rear view mirror with the smuggest freaking grin on his face. I had to step out of the car and get away from him because I was getting so worked up. I don't think there's a punishment severe enough for that monster. He walked into a business right at closing time when there were no customers left and only one 18-year-old female employee. At gunpoint, he took all the money that he could, then forced her to take off all her clothes and perform oral on him. He then took her in the back room, tied her up, and penetrated her with the barrel of the gun for several minutes before barricading the back room door so she couldn't get out and leaving her there. Turns out he was a former employee and, if you can believe it, convicted sex offender who had made several passes at the victim while they worked together and been rejected every time. He was there to rob the place, but when he saw who was working he figured he'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Catching him was among the more satisfying moments of my career. A few years ago we get sent as the second car to a family disturbance, sent as routine. Halfway there we get updated to roll code 3 to a shots fired call. At the same house, we arrive and there is a young man with what looks like a stick in his hand lying on the ground, already 0, dead. My partners have an older man in handcuffs in the back of their unit. After speaking to a lady, the wife, and another young man, son, who were home, the story comes out. The family disturbance was the deceased young man breaking a chair and hitting his dad with the broken chair legs. Dad gets gun, warns son. Son doesn't stop. Dad shoots son in face and kills him. I will never forget the way the father looked me in the eye and said, "I'm going to heck for this, aren't I?" Had a guy who had been fricking his girlfriend's 3-year-old daughter. He found out he had gotten busted and took a whole bunch of methadone and probably anything else in the house he could get his hands on. Was found unresponsive and put in an ice bath by his friends, and one of them was nice enough to call 911. Heck of it is that when we show up the girlfriend is defending him, stashing contraband and trying to keep us from entering the department without a warrant. Exigent circumstances, hip hip hooray, get out of my way, and we got him to the hospital. Heck of it is that while we got him out she flushed all their crap and deleted all the images from his phone of the Arpes. Frickin' mom choosing her rapist boyfriend over her daughter. Lowest of the low. He pled to a lesser charge eventually due to a lack of evidence, and she caught a tampering with physical evidence charge and got her kid taken away. She's out and works at a local restaurant that I'll never go to again. Cop here. I responded to a child not breathing. On arrival I find a 2-year-old girl, wearing only undies, unconscious on the cement kitchen floor. She is freezing cold, pale, foaming at the mouth, and barely breathing. I spent the next 6 hours by her side as detectives learned that mom's boyfriend was mad that she wouldn't stop crying, so he picked up by the waist, over his head, and slammed her on the ground, twice. When mom got out of the shower he told her she wasn't breathing right. Mom uses the girl's asthma inhaler twice, and waits. An hour and a half later she goes to her neighbor's house to use her phone to call her mom. The neighbor overhears a conversation about baby not breathing and takes it upon herself to call 911. The girl received a basal skull fracture which caused little seizures. She vomited several times but lay on her back for over an hour. She aspirated the vomit repeatedly. For nearly 2 hours that little girl lay on the ground with her skull bleeding into her brain, her body temp being sucked into the floor, trying to breathe vomit. And for the next 6 hours I sat with her and held her hand, stroked her hair, and watched her die, hoping that her little brain shut down and blocked out everything that was happening. That case still makes me tear up to this day, and it was one of the 3 worst calls I've ever been on. I don't know how someone can do that to a baby. Triple homicide suspect fled and was spotted by an officer in our city about 30 minutes after the last person he shot. High speed pursuit at 120 miles per hour for 12 miles until he crashed and rolled his car. He was so disoriented it made it easy to arrest him. He had an arsenal in his car and I'm sure he would have shot at us if not for rolling his car first. It was crazy coming down from the feeling of preparing to shoot and possibly kill somebody. I thought for sure it was going to be a shootout when he stopped. Then I rode with him to the hospital in an ambulance. Got to talking with him and realized I went to school with him and knew his family. Really messed up. Man convicted of groping a 7-year-old girl. Got placed on probation. Walked by me at Walmart one day, holding hands with a 6-year-old boy. My worst was a reopens to a home for attempted suicide with the individual still armed with a knife. When we arrived the suspect was walking down the side of the road at 3 AM. Covered in blood from having cut himself over most of his body with moderate to deep cut he was covered. While we were standing around ordering him to drop the knife he stood like a statue not saying anything but staring. This guy was a towering 6'5" 220 pound man who looked at me a 6' 160 pound 22-year-old and said I'm going to take your gun and shoot him, referring to my FTO at the time who was similarly built to me. I deployed a taser which did nothing but anger him. My FTO deployed his which brought him down. Trying to handcuff a man covered in blood is terrifying. All the bloodborne diseases you can contract. He was transported to the hospital for his self-inflicted wounds. Upon further investigation this guy had been luring cats and dogs to him which he would end up killing and skinning. In this guy's shed he had a harvesting room where he would turn the pelts of these animals into clothing. You name it this guy had made it. The entire thing reminded me of some horror movie with a stench you could not stomach. That was my first week as a sworn officer. I turned 21 3 days before graduating the academy. I've been on now for a year or so and that is the only guy I have ever met I believe could have taken my weapon and kill me. He later was declared mentally competent and charged. He as well was not suicidal but angry because he messed up on one of his creations. I honestly feel that the majority of the people I arrest aren't bad people and aren't criminals, per se. That being said there are a couple dozen arrests that stand out in my mind. One in particular sticks out, not necessarily the worst, just one that sticks out the most. The suspect was approximately 40-ish, had a 15-year-old daughter, was a methamphetamine addict, lived in complete squalor. They get evicted and daughter gets taken into state custody. After a year of counseling finally discloses that her father would inject her with methamphetamine and pay her. A therapist comes to us and we bring her in for an interview. This girl, I believe may have been 17 by now, is no girl. She is intelligent, articulate and lived well beyond her years. She tells in remarkable detail how one night her father injects methamphetamine into right forearm. This happened several times. One night he is extremely high, gets her high. As she is walking into the kitchen he pins her against the wall and arpests her. This begins to happen on a regular basis. Suspect eventually convinces daughter to start bringing friends home. Suspect injects friends with methamphetamine and arpests them as well. Daughter continues to bring different friends home so that dad will pay the friends rather than her. Eventually when they get evicted, father kicks daughter to the curb and two of daughter's friends go live out of dad's car in a nearby park. While these kinds of things happen all the time, it was the victim that struck me. When asked why she didn't tell someone, she replied, "The first time it happened when he pinned me against the wall. All I could remember thinking over and over, this is my life now. I will remember those words for the rest of my life, as clear as they were said to me. I can still hear the inflection and tone in her voice." About 8 months later I ran into one of the other victims, the daughter's friend. After dad was evicted he lived out of his car with her. She was 15ish at the time. Initially she was going to cooperate in prosecution, however, disappeared. She's 18-19 now. When I last saw her I didn't recognize her until I saw her identification. Methamphetamine in the streets have destroyed her. She won't be alive much longer. Guy killed his girlfriend's baby by wrapping a towel around his neck and swung him around. On way to jail he kept saying, "Real talk bruh, I didn't kill that baby." He is presently serving 20+ years. Kid had a broken neck and multiple skull fractures. A fellow who groped a number of his preteen daughter's friends. He'd have her invite them over for movies and such, then drug their sonid and pay them. We never figured out exactly how many girls he paid, but we were able to prove up 28 counts. The arrest was not particularly satisfying. Having to be near him and listen to his diatribe made me feel unclean. His conviction and subsequent long sentence made me feel like being a cop was worth it at least 1% of the time. Met Police, London, officer. A guy got arrested overnight by uniform for possession of a lock knife. He was sleeping rough on a riverbank. I was assigned to deal with him in the morning. He was Lithuanian. Before I dealt with him and the knife, a check revealed he had a Europe-wide alert in him, but no detail about what this alert was. So I had to call several different agencies and teams, and eventually it turned out he was wanted on a European arrest warrant by Lithuania. I got sent through the paperwork, and when I saw the circumstances I was shocked. He's escaped from prison and fled Lithuania. What was he in prison for? Him and 5 of his buddies had paid a preteen girl in an abandoned factory for 6 hours. Arrested a doctor for sexually battering female patients. I've had partners of mine arrest even more awful people, but this man I actually arrested. He would only target his female clients who were mental health patients, so that many of their claims were overlooked due to their existing bipolar disorders or depression. He was a pose and his wife sat next to him the entire trial. True love, right? He lost his medical license, but we lost the case due to almost half of his victims refusing to testify and his high dollar, very educated attorney. You have been visited by the Good Sleep Pizza. You will be blessed with cozy sleeps, but only if you upvote before going to sleep. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.